Level 989.
Welcome to 989 on Health, a show where you don't need years of university to understand the latest news about health and related subjects. As always, please remember that we've created a bunch of links to more info on today's topic at our website, level989.com.
An important announcement for our listeners. This podcast is intended to be an informal tool for laymen and practitioners alike to hear our viewpoints on health and wellness. Don't rely on the information in this podcast as an alternative to medical advice from your doctor or other professional healthcare provider. For the full disclaimer, please see our website.
I'm Mike Davalos, just a guy, your average Joe, and I'm joined by the opposite of average, Brandon Weintraub, a primary care physician. Good morning, Brandon.
Good morning, Mike.
Our topic for today is fermented foods. We talked in a recent episode about how the human invention of pre-processing our food, cooking and cutting it, had a huge impact on our bodies. Over time, it actually changed the shape and size of the human skull, because when food's easier to chew, you don't need huge teeth, a massive jaw, and heavy jaw muscles to make it all work. We briefly touched on fermented foods in that episode, but we've decided the topic needs some additional attention. Fermenting is another important way we humans process our food before eating it. When I think about fermentation, my first thought is about alcohol, and it's odd to think about, but the earliest fermented foods humans ate were probably half-rotten fruits that people discovered under various fruit trees. Times were hard back in the day, so if all you found to eat today was some beyond ripe fruit, you might take your chances and eat it. Interestingly, there are some naturally occurring alcohols in these fruit, and some animals, including fruit flies and some fruit bats, have been known to seek out naturally fermented fruits for their medicinal properties. Have you heard about this?
I can't say I knew about the bats and flies in particular, but I'm not really surprised. If you've ever had a problem with flies in your house, I'd be willing to bet you've run across the advice to make a fly trap using apple cider vinegar. Fruit flies are attracted to the gases given off by rotting fruit and vegetation, which is their primary food source and also a prime location for laying eggs. And the smell of vinegar indicates an exciting source of nutrition for these flies. The attraction to fermented foods is found across the animal kingdom. Any food source that has nutritional benefits which are as easily processed and absorbed as a fermented fruit is a welcome boon to any creature. And animals using plants and available materials for their health benefits is nothing new. There are stories about Chinese medicinal herbs that were found by observing animals and what they eat. In 1987, a scientist by the name of Michael Huffman observed a chimp using a local plant to help solve her parasite infestation.
It might have been the start of fermented foods, but I don't think anyone's going to try to live on spoiled fruit day after day if they can find other options. I think it's most likely that the first fermented human foods were accidentally fermented. Maybe you're storing some starchy food in a basket or a clay pot. Your food gets wet and the microbes start to do their work. You come back and your food's all wet and maybe a little scummy or foamy. But you spent the day hunting and gathering with nothing to show for it. You're hungry, and yesterday's slightly off leftovers is all you have. And a lot of food probably isn't very palatable until you've let it soak for a few days. A lot of roots and tubers are this way. Brandon, does this sound reasonable, or am I way off base here?
Well, there are a fair number of theories about how the process of fermentation was discovered and introduced. Many of them sound remarkably similar to what you're suggesting. One theory suggests that the Neolithic age is a possible origin. That's about 7,000 years ago. Humans of the time figure out how to milk cows, and shortly thereafter discover, hey, it curdles only a few hours after they've milked the cow. They go ahead and try storing it in different containers, or maybe adding a vegetable or fruit juice, and find out that it can last longer or taste better if they do things just right. Another theory suggests an even earlier discovery date, about 12,000 years ago in the Paleolithic age, where a bit of fermented honey may have made the first mead. Regardless of the exact method and date of discovery, every culture, since recorded history has begun, seems to have found their own ways of implementing fermentation. In the end, it usually comes down to sitting, soaking, and a bit of patience.
Okay, people discovered that some foods are actually better if you let them sit and soak a bit. And sometimes drinking the water you drain off at the end of the process can give you this nice, relaxed, warm feeling. The truth is all lost in prehistory, but first of all, which do you think came first, bread or beer? They both seem to be intertwined. There's even theories that humans settled down and started farming so they could have a more consistent supply of beer. If I remember right, even a weak beer was safer to drink than water for most of civilization. And second, how are bread and beer important in our health history?
I'll start with the easy part of your question, and agree with you. For much of early civilization, water sources were at least moderately dangerous. Whether they were filled with bacteria naturally, or poisoned by waste generated by the humans and animals living nearby, drinking water was a bit of a roulette game. However, if you added a bit of grain and let fermentation occur, the beneficial bacteria population grew and alcohol did its thing, killing off most of the remaining harmful organisms. It also meant an additional source of calories and a means to relax a little after a very difficult day of work. Health history of beer is much more complicated. Chinese medicine definitely considers alcohol to be medicinal. Alcohol is used as a means to distribute herbs into the body and focus the medications in a specific way. Even without herbal medicines added, wines and beers are considered for their beneficial properties when used in moderation and at the right times. Honestly, and finally, I really can't say which came first, bread or beer. I know that the earliest record of beer is shown in a pictogram from a Mesopotamian culture, and that the region that this culture was found in existed because of its ideal climate for growing and cultivating crops, especially wheat. So, was grain harvested initially to make beer, or was the harvesting of grain for breads what spurred on the creation of beer?
In our modern era, bread often gets a bad rap because it's often seen as excess carbs. But bread was very important in the development of human civilization. And the whole grain, high fiber, dark breads of the olden days was made up of good, wholesome stuff that it really earned it the prestige as a vital invention in food history. But I could go on and on about bread. I'm sure we'll do a whole episode on it eventually. One of the major elements of fermented foods is that in some cases they can have a positive probiotic effect on the body, good microbes that actually help us. But there's also research that says these good microbes don't actually have a chance to make it far enough into the body to do any good before they're killed off for a number of reasons. So I'll leave it to you. I'm sure you know the definitive answer about probiotics with no more waffling.
We finally found an instance where I actually don't feel the need to waffle. Probiotics, as you mentioned, are essentially bacteria that seem to have an active role to play in human health. Initially, the thought was that these microorganisms affected little more than the digestive system. But as we've discussed in previous episodes, more and more research is coming forward that shows the correct balance and types of bacteria in the digestive system can affect everything from emotional issues to chronic health conditions. While the research on the modern methods of getting probiotics into the body, and by that I mean the ever-growing plethora of pills, powders, and other supplements, while that research is still underdeveloped, there is less and less doubt that probiotics are essential to improving and maintaining a healthy body. We spoke about fecal matter transplants in our Medicine of the Future episode a while back. Those transplants are essentially a more direct means of supplementing the body's current bacterial content with a potentially quote-unquote better variety. Yogurts, kefirs, and fermented foods are less severe, more palatable means of getting a body's flora back in balance.
Hold on a moment. Can you explain what was it kefir? What's that?
Kefir? Kefir is essentially a fermented milk drink. It's milk with grains used as the primary fermentation starter. It's kind of like a drinkable yogurt, and it's absolutely delicious. So, I will continue with this. It's likely not just the probiotic content of foods that makes the difference to your health. Another concept that's gained interest in recent years is prebiotics. It's essentially fibers that provide ideal nutrition for the beneficial bacteria that's already present in your body. The argument regarding probiotics stems from the fragility of the organisms in a food like yogurt. Stomach acid may destroy a large number of probiotics before they have had a chance to take root and grow. However, by eating foods and supplements that act as prebiotics, the good bacteria that are already present in your system are given a chance to bloom on their own. I've seen patients gain benefits from taking probiotics, so I'm uncomfortable with the idea that they're ineffective. I do, however, think that changing your diet to include natural probiotics and to include prebiotics as well is definitely better than simply taking a pill or a powder.
Well, that seems to be a good transition to our next item in the fermentation timeline, foods like yogurt and cheese. More accidental discoveries, the sort of thing that happens when you let your food sit around too long. In ancient times, life was brutal, food was scarce, and you couldn't just toss something into the campfire because it had a bit of mold on it. I'm sure that many people learned the hard way what food poisoning can do to you, everything from deadly bacteria to the toxins they can produce. But some things actually got better with age. Let's skip lactose intolerance for now, but what can you tell me about the health benefits of yogurt and cheese?
Well, without discussing lactose intolerance, the primary benefits of yogurts and cheeses come from their probiotic content. Milks, yogurts, and cheeses all have about the same content of protein, fats, and calcium, so the most significant difference lies in the healthy bacterial content present after the aging and fermentation processes.
The invention of vinegar doesn't really sound like a groundbreaking development, but it was a very important step in food preservation history. Keep in mind, for most of our time on Earth, we didn't have refrigeration technology. Vinegar was probably another accident, a brewing accident most likely. Brewing beer is a finicky process and it's easy to ruin a batch. If you're trying to brew yourself a nice light ale or a cider from some fruity juices, a little too much air gets in, then bacteria eats your alcohol and you get an acidic liquid that won't get you drunk, but it has other useful applications. Can you give us a few examples? What's vinegar good for, health-wise?
Wow, that's a pretty long list. Vinegar has shown potential benefits to cardiovascular health and improving blood sugar regulation. It has some antibacterial properties and has even been shown in specific conditions to affect neoplastic growth. I'll provide a link to an NCBI article that discusses some of the specifics.
Wow, that's the shortest answer you've ever given me. Are you feeling all right? Also, what's neoplastic? Is that nerve fibers?
Neoplastic is a term that basically describes new growth of cells. So cancers are called neoplastic growths.
I have never heard that term, I don't think. Now, I'm an American with the typical bland American palate, so the only fermented foods I personally eat are pickles. But, I don't even eat pickles anymore, come to think of it. If I do eat a pickle, it's in the form of relish on a hot dog. Speaking of hot dogs, they're all about vinegar. There's dirty water recipes for hot dog prep that include adding vinegar to the water, and mustard often has vinegar in it. And wait a second, so does ketchup. Another hot dog topping, sauerkraut, is also made with vinegar. Although I'm a lot more likely to have sauerkraut on a Reuben. The sandwich? Rye bread, corned beef, and before you ask, no, corned beef isn't fermented, it's salt cured. Salt. Oh, but do you eat any fermented foods? I know you're a lot more of a cook and adventurous eater than I am.
Well, I've only made homemade corned beef once, but it was wonderful. I regularly enjoy yogurts, sauerkraut sometimes, and imported cheeses are a personal weakness of mine. I love kimchi, which is a fermented cabbage dish, and I especially like kombucha, which is a fermented tea that involves a colony of yeast and bacteria.
Before we get too far away from vinegar, in my research, while a lot of people were touting the use of vinegar for a wide variety of health concerns, but it looks like there's risks too. Vinegar can apparently damage the enamel of your teeth. There have been some instances of damage to the esophagus, lowered potassium levels in the body, even osteoporosis. First, is this another example of anything can hurt you at the wrong dosage or used too often? Second, why are low potassium levels a problem?
This is kind of an example of too much of anything can hurt you, but I had some trouble finding the research that provided instances of bone density issues and hypokalemia, low potassium, which were directly related to the long-term use of vinegar. In fact, the warnings I found were really only on WebMD, and those were, after the research I did, apparently based off of one case in a hospital. So, as with every warning or claim of benefit, take these concerns with a grain of salt, and make sure to monitor your own results with your physician. There is some research that shows that the process of breaking down acetic acid, which is what's found in vinegar, when you break down acetic acid in the liver, you may need potassium to do that. So that plus the potential diuretic effects of ongoing vinegar supplementation may be the action which causes reduced potassium levels. And you asked why hypokalemia might be a concern. So I'll tell you a story. A few years ago, this is when I was still in school, I found myself experiencing some pretty concerning symptoms. My heart rate was elevated and it felt incredibly irregular. There was a pain in my chest, it radiated to my arms, and I had an incredible sense of anxiety. Sounded a lot like a heart attack. It turned out it wasn't a heart attack, but I did have incredibly low levels of potassium. Electrolytes play an incredibly important role systemically, especially in your muscles, including those involved in pumping your blood. So any time that your potassium or any other electrolyte might be affected, you need to be concerned.
I remember hearing about your visit to the doctor on that one, and that was scary. You're too young to have heart trouble. In my research, I came across some references to health risks when it comes to fermented foods in general, beyond the dangers of vinegar. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there was a study that showed fermented soy products increased the likelihood of gastric cancer as compared to unfermented soy consumption. And the World Health Organization has labeled fermented foods as potentially carcinogenic. That means cancer-causing. The list also includes substances running the gamut from alcohol to asbestos. My personal experience with fermented foods has been overwhelmingly positive. But just like with anything else you decide to put in your body, it's important to keep an eye on how it affects you as an individual.
This next item isn't exactly a medical angle, but I always think of it whenever I think about vinegar, which isn't very often, really. We never really used it when I was growing up, so I typically forget that vinegar exists. There's an interesting old painting from China called the Vinegar Tasters. Have you heard of it?
I never knew the name of the painting, although once I looked it up, I have definitely seen it dozens of times.
I'm not surprised. For those of you who don't know, the Vinegar Tasters painting is kind of a New Yorker cartoon from hundreds of years ago, though it's not making a political point, but a philosophical one. Can you break it down for us briefly? I never intended for this to become the vinegar episode.
I will be as brief as I can. So, we're definitely going to go ahead and post a link. Go ahead and take a look, and that way you'll have an idea of what we're talking about. So, the painting shows 3 men around a large container. The 3 men are dipping their fingers in the vat of vinegar and tasting it. According to modern interpretations, the 3 men are meant to represent the lead figures of 3 of the most important philosophical systems from Chinese culture: Confucius, in charge of Confucianism, Buddha, Buddhism, and Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu, Taoism. The expressions on each face from tasting the vinegar represents the key elements of each belief system. Confucius has a sour expression. Confucianism believed that men were essentially sour and required stringent rules and structure to improve. Buddha is wearing a bitter expression. Buddhism, at its core, believes that life is held back by inappropriate attachments to earthly things, and only by letting go of these connections to the world can a person transcend their own limitations. And finally, Lao Tzu is smiling. And Taoism is founded on the practice of respecting everything's nature and purpose. So the idea is that although vinegar is both bitter and sour, this is how vinegar is supposed to be, and is enjoyable because of these flavors.
It's all about perspective. I have to admit that I fall more towards the Confucianism side. I really like rules and order, even though I really appreciate the happier Taoist angle. But this isn't a philosophy podcast, thank goodness. I know even less about philosophy than I do about medicine, which is a scary thought. Is there anything else you want to mention about fermented foods before we wrap it up?
Fermented foods seem to have garnered an astonishing amount of interest. Western medicine has just begun to scratch the surface of its benefits, and the potential risks, of eating fermented foods. And Eastern medicine still includes a strong focus on dietary changes to improve patient health. There is a strong emphasis on the importance and use of fermented foods and beverages. Even wine or other alcohol can be helpful in the right circumstances, and the importance of correctly balancing and maintaining gut flora is being confirmed in new ways and ongoing studies. Eating the right foods in the right amounts can make a huge difference in resolving a multitude of health concerns. So if you're looking to make a significant change to your health, it may well be worth discussing what benefits you might find from adding fermented foods to your regular diet.
That's all the time we have for today. These are short episodes that provide a brief overview of very complex topics. Everything we say is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Licensed healthcare professionals should advise you and be aware about changes you make to any aspect of your healthcare. Every person's needs are different. The links to references we've made about news articles, medical studies, or other materials can be found at level989.com/health, along with our contact information and the complete Don't Take Medical Advice from Podcasts disclaimer. Thanks for listening, and now go health yourself.